Stay silent, the wolfless Omega whispered to the Alpha King. The reason will leave you frozen. Thomas, the Alpha King, whose roar could shatter glass and whose command could bring armies to their knees, lay paralyzed, not by magic, but by a sudden, terrifying clarity. He looked up at Alice, the girl they called Nothing. Her eyes were wide, filled not with malice, but with a catastrophic terror. She leaned down, her lips brushing the shell of his ear, the intimacy stark against the violence of the moment. "Stay silent," she breathed, a plea that felt heavier than a death sentence. "If you scream, it wakes up." The blade of the knife hovered inches from the king's throat, but the hand holding it didn't tremble. It wasn't an assassin's hand. It was small, calloused from scrubbing floors, and belonged to a girl who didn't exist in the eyes of the court. The grand hall of the Silver Moon Pack was a cavernous maw of stone and velvet, designed to amplify the grandeur of the predator. Tonight it smelled of roasted venison, spilled wine, and the cloying, metallic scent of aggressive pheromones. It was the winter solstice, the night the Alpha King selected his inner circle, and the tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Alice moved through the crowd like a shadow stitched into the background. She wore the rough, scratchy grey wool of the wolfless, the lowest caste, the genetic dead ends who could not shift, could not hear the pack mind, and were treated with less regard than the hunting hounds. She carried a heavy silver tray, laden with crystal goblets, her eyes fixed on the floor. To look an alpha in the eye was an insult. To look at the king was a death wish. "Out of the way, runt," a beta guard sneered, shoving her shoulder with the butt of his spear. Alice stumbled, the crystal chiming dangerously, but she didn't drop it. She didn't gasp. She didn't apologize. She simply righted herself, her face a mask of practiced vacancy. This was her survival mechanism. Become furniture. Become air. If you are nothing, they cannot break you. But Alice was not nothing. Inside her chest, beneath the steady rhythm of a human heart, something ancient, coiled and uncoiled, restless and hungry. She kept her jaw locked tight. Silence was her cage. At the head of the room, on a dais of obsidian, sat Thomas. The Alpha King was a study in lethal elegance. He was young, having only taken the throne a year ago after the brutal death of his father, but his eyes were ancient, storm-grey and exhausted. He leaned back in his throne, one hand massaging his temple, a glass of dark liquor dangling from his fingers. To the court, he looked bored. Alice knew better. Even from the back of the room, she could feel the static electricity radiating off him. He wasn't bored. He was in agony. The gift of the Alpha King was to hear the thoughts of his pack, a telepathic hive mind meant to ensure unity. But the pack was massive, thousands of voices, screaming desires, plots, fears, and lusts. Thomas was drowning in the noise. She could see the way his jaw feathered, the way his pupils dilated, not with interest, but with sensory overload. Alice navigated the sea of silk and muscle, tasked with refilling the goblets at the high table. She moved closer to the dais. The closer she got, the more the air felt heavy, charged with the sheer magnitude of Thomas's power. She reached the side of the throne. Her presence usually went unnoticed, but as she stepped into the king's personal radius, a roughly 6-foot circle around the throne, something impossible happened. Thomas froze. The glass slipped from his fingers. It shattered against the obsidian floor, the sound like a gunshot in the sudden hush of the room. Red liquid pooled like blood near Alice's worn boots. The entire hall went silent. Every eye turned to the king, and then to the servant girl standing over the mess. Thomas didn't look at the mess. He looked at her. For the first time in 10 years, the screaming in his head had stopped. The voices, the conniving thoughts of his generals, the lustful fantasies of the courtiers, it was all gone. Silence. Absolute, blissful, terrifying silence. It radiated from the girl. She was a void in the Force, a walking dead zone. "You," Thomas whispered, his voice rough with disuse. He stood up, towering over her, his shadow swallowing her small frame. Alice's heart hammered against her ribs, but not out of fear of punishment. She was terrified he would notice why the voices stopped. She wasn't just blocking the telepathy, she was absorbing it. "Clean it up." Lord Marcus, the king's uncle, barked from the side, stepping forward to break the strange tension. "Stupid girl. Clumsy wolfless filth." Thomas held up a hand, silencing his uncle instantly. He stepped down from the dais, his boots crunching on the broken glass. He ignored the shards. He reached out, his large hand capturing Alice's chin, forcing her to look up. Her eyes were not the submissive brown of a servant. They were violet, a color that shouldn't exist in their bloodline. "Who are you?" Thomas demanded, the command laced with alpha power that should have forced her to her knees. Alice didn't kneel. She couldn't. The thing inside her bristled at the command, fighting back. She clamped her lips shut, biting her tongue until she tasted copper. "Do not speak. Do not speak." "I asked you a question," Thomas growled, his eyes narrowing. The peace she brought him was addictive, but her defiance was baffling. No wolfless could withstand a direct alpha command. The court held its breath. This was it. The execution of a clumsy servant. Alice trembled, fighting the urge to open her mouth. If she spoke now, with the adrenaline spiking and the entity inside her waking up, she wouldn't just answer him. She would level the castle. So, she did the only unpredictable thing a servant could do. She slapped his hand away. The sound echoed through the hall. Gasps erupted. Swords were drawn with the hiss of steel against leather. Alice spun on her heel and ran. Thomas stood frozen, his hand still suspended in the air where her skin had been. The moment she broke contact and fled toward the service doors, the noise crashed back into his skull. How dare she? Kill her! Is the king weak? Who is she? My feet hurt. Plotting the coup starts tonight. The voices returned with the force of a tidal wave, buckling his knees. Thomas roared, clutching his head, the sudden return of the sensory overload blinding him. "Caesar!" Lord Marcus shouted, sensing the king's distress and interpreting it as rage. "Bring me her head." "No," Thomas bellowed, the word cracking the stone pillars of the hall. The sheer force of his voice threw the nearest guards backward. He straightened, eyes glowing a feral amber. The pain was excruciating, but the memory of that silence, that cool, clear water in the desert of his mind, was vivid. He needed it back. He needed her. "No one touches her," Thomas snarled, his voice dropping to a predatory rumble that vibrated in the chests of every wolf in the room. "She is mine." He didn't wait for his guards. He leaped over the high table, shifting mid-air. Bones cracked and reshaped, fur sprouted, and a massive midnight black wolf landed on the stone floor, claws scrabbling for traction before launching toward the door Alice had fled through. Alice ran through the labyrinthine corridors of the servant quarters. She didn't go to her room. That was the first place they would look. She headed for the catacombs, the old wine cellars that ran deep beneath the castle, built into the mountain itself. She wasn't running to escape punishment. She was running because the entity was awake. "Let us out," the voice hissed in her mind. It wasn't telepathy, it was something older. He is strong. He would be a fine vessel. Better than this fragile shell. "Shut up," she whispered to the empty stone corridor, clutching her chest. Her skin burned. Veins of black mist began to trace their way up her neck. She could hear the pursuit, not the heavy boots of guards, but the rhythmic, terrifying thrum, thrum, thrum of a massive predator. The king was hunting her personally. She burst into the cold night air of the lower courtyard, intending to cross to the old ruins, but a shadow detached itself from the darkness. The black wolf landed in front of her, cutting off her path. He was huge, his shoulder height reaching her chest, his teeth bared not in aggression, but in a heavy, panting grin. Alice skidded to a halt in the snow, her breath plumed in the freezing air. The wolf didn't attack. He stepped closer, and as he did, the noise in his head died down again. Alice watched the tension leave his massive frame. He stepped closer, almost lovingly, craving the silence she projected. But Alice knew the danger. If he got too close, if he touched her while she was this unstable, the transfer would happen. The entity would jump. It craved power, and Thomas was the most powerful thing for miles. "Stay back," she warned, backing up until her spine hit the stone wall of the courtyard. The wolf shimmered, fur retracting into skin, and Thomas stood there, naked from the waist up, steam rising from his shoulders. He looked wild, desperate. "Why?" he rasped, stepping into her personal space, caging her against the wall with his arms. "Why does the world stop when you are near?" "Because I am the end of it," Alice said, her voice trembling. "You don't understand, Your Majesty. You think I'm wolfless? I'm not empty. I'm full. Too full." Thomas shook his head, the reprieve from the mental noise making him intoxicated. He leaned his forehead against hers. "I don't care. I can think. For the first time in years, I can think." "You have to let me go," she pleaded. "If I stay, I will kill you." "Try," he challenged softly. And then, the unpredictable happened. The entity lashed out. A shockwave of black energy erupted from Alice's chest. It should have thrown Thomas across the courtyard. It should have stopped his heart. Instead, Thomas absorbed it. His alpha aura flared gold, clashing with her black mist, and he groaned, not in pain, but in pleasure. He didn't die. He fed on the excess energy she couldn't control. Alice stared at him, stunned. He was a grounding wire. He was the only thing strong enough to take the overflow without breaking. Thomas pulled back, his eyes clearing, the amber fading to a calm grey. He looked at her with a mix of awe and possessiveness that made her knees weak. "You," he whispered, tracing the line of her jaw, "are not going anywhere." Thomas didn't drag her to a dungeon. He carried her, bridal style despite her protests, straight through the main corridors, past the gawking courtiers, and up the winding stairs to the royal wing. The scandal was immediate and electric. The Alpha King carrying a wolfless servant. It was unheard of. It was political suicide. "Put me down," Alice hissed, hiding her face against his chest to avoid the burning stares of the guards. "You're making a mistake. They will tear you apart for this." "Let them try," Thomas muttered. He felt stronger than he had in years. The constant drain of the pack mind was gone, dampened by the girl in his arms. He kicked open the double doors to his private chambers and dumped her unceremoniously onto the massive, fur-covered bed. Alice scrambled backward, pressing herself against the headboard. "This is kidnapping." "This is sanity," Thomas corrected. He paced the room, the energy crackling off him. He went to a sideboard and poured a drink, his hand steady for the first time. "What is your name? The real one." "Alice," she said. "Alice," he tested the name. "And what are you, Alice? Because you aren't human, and you certainly aren't a wolf." Alice pulled her knees to her chest. The entity was quiet now, sated by the brief contact with Thomas's power. "My mother called me a silencer. The pack records call me an abomination." Thomas paused. "A silencer. Legend says they were wiped out during the Great Purge. Living weapons designed to hunt alphas." "We weren't designed to hunt you," Alice said softly, looking at her hands. "We were designed to balance you. But alphas got greedy. They didn't want balance. They wanted total control. So they killed us." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the frayed hem of her dress, the scars on her arms from hot water and rough brushes. You've been hiding in my kitchens, starving, being beaten by my guards. It was the safest place, Alice shrugged. Who looks for a god-killer scrubbing the toilets? A knock at the door interrupted them. Enter, Thomas commanded, though he positioned himself between the door and Alice. Lord Marcus entered, accompanied by a woman who oozed danger, Lady Elara. Elara was the alpha of the Southern Territory, beautiful, ambitious, and Thomas's intended betrothed according to the council. Elara's eyes snapped to Alice on the bed, and her lip curled in disgust. Thomas, the council is in an uproar. You left the solstice feast to chase a servant girl, and now she is in your bed. She is under my protection, Thomas said calmly. She is a wolfless, Marcus spat. She is bad luck, and after that display in the hall, she is dangerous. She attacked you. She startled me, Thomas lied smoothly. I was drunk. Elara stepped forward, the silk of her red dress rustling like dry leaves. Thomas, look at her. She's filthy. Send her to the dungeons. I will help you calm the pack. You need a queen, not a pet. Alice watched them. She saw something Thomas didn't. Shadows were dancing around Elara's shadow, unnatural, jagged shapes. Elara wasn't just a wolf. She was dabbling in dark magic. She smells like rot, the entity whispered in Alice's mind. Let me eat her. Alice flinched, gripping the sheets. Get out, Thomas said, his voice low. Thomas, Marcus began. Get out! Thomas roared. The force of it shook the paintings on the walls. Elara's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine hate replacing the seductress act. You are making a mistake, my king. The pack will not follow a leader who beds the help. They left, the heavy doors slamming shut. Thomas turned back to Alice, his expression grim. They're right about one thing. You are in danger here. Marcus has wanted my crown since my father died, and Elara wants power above all else. I can protect myself, Alice said, sliding off the bed. No, Thomas said, closing the distance between them. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently touch the pulse point on her neck. You have to stay silent, remember? If you unleash that power, you destroy everything. So what do we do? Alice asked, her breath hitching at his touch. We pretend, Thomas said, a dark smirk touching his lips. It made him look less like a king and more like the rogue he was at heart. They think you're my whore? Fine. Let them think it. While they're distracted by the scandal, I'm going to use you to silence the noise in my head so I can finally hunt down the traitors in my court. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. You are going to be my shield, Alice, and in return, I will be your sword. Alice looked into his grey eyes and realized two things. First, he was terrifyingly intelligent. Second, she was already falling in love with him. And that was the most dangerous thing of all, because if a silencer falls in love with an alpha, the ancient texts didn't predict balance. They predicted the apocalypse. Deal, she whispered. Outside the window, a crow watched them with 3 eyes, then took flight, heading straight for Lord Marcus's tower. The game had begun, and the pieces were moving faster than either of them realized. The morning sun hit the royal wing with the subtlety of a hammer, but for the first time in a decade, Thomas didn't wake up wishing for the sweet release of death. The silence in his head was absolute. It was a physical weight, a velvet blanket draped over his raw, overstimulated neurons. He rolled over, the massive furs of his bed pooling around his waist. The spot beside him was empty. Panic, sharp and cold, spiked in his chest. The noise of the castle began to bleed back in, a low hum of hungry, cold, ambitious, scared, creeping into his periphery. I'm here, a voice said from the shadows near the balcony. Thomas exhaled, the noise receding instantly. Alice sat curled in a velvet armchair that looked like it would swallow her whole. She was still wearing her grey wool rags, hugging her knees, watching him with those violet eyes that seemed too old for her face. "You didn't sleep," Thomas stated, sitting up. His scars, remnants of challenges won and wars fought, were silver ridges against his tan skin. "The entity doesn't sleep," Alice replied quietly, "and if I sleep too deeply, it goes for a walk." Thomas stood, unashamed of his nudity, and walked to the wardrobe. He threw a silk robe over his shoulders, tying it loosely. "We have a performance to give. The court expects a scandal. Let's give them a tragedy instead." He tossed a bundle of fabric at her. It wasn't a servant's uniform, but it wasn't a queen's gown either. It was black leather and silver mesh, riding gear, functional but finely made. "Put this on," he commanded, but the bite was gone from his voice. "We ride the boundaries today. If I'm going to hunt traitors, I need to know where the rot begins." An hour later, they descended the grand staircase. The transformation was jarring. Alice, the invisible girl, now walked at the right hand of the Alpha King. The black leather fit her frame like a second skin, hiding her fragility, but accentuating the dangerous stillness that surrounded her. The Whispering Court, as the inner circle was known, was waiting in the courtyard. Lord Marcus stood by his horse, looking like he had swallowed a lemon. Lady Alara was mounted on a white mare, looking pristine and lethal. "Your Majesty," Marcus bowed stiffly. "Is it wise? Taking a pet on a patrol?" Thomas swung onto his massive black stallion, Midnight, without using the stirrups. He reached down, ignoring the gasps of the courtiers, and hoisted Alice up to sit in front of him. "She isn't a pet, Uncle," Thomas said, his voice carrying over the wind. He wrapped one arm around Alice's waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The contact sent a jolt through both of them, a feedback loop of silence and power. "She is my compass." He spurred the horse, and they thundered out of the gates, the rest of the guard scrambling to keep up. For hours they rode through the snow-laden forests of the Silver Moon territory. For the guards, it was a patrol. For Thomas, it was an investigation. With Alice dampening the cacophony of the pack mind, he could focus on specific threads of thought. He could target the telepathy. He probed the minds of the guards riding behind them. "Hope the king doesn't notice the missing shipment. Alara promised me a promotion if I report back. Marcus is meeting the southern alphas at the old ruins." Thomas stiffened. Alice felt it. "What is it?" she whispered, leaning back against him. The heat of him was seeping into her frozen bones. "Traitors," Thomas murmured into her hair. "Everywhere. But I can see them now." They stopped near a frozen lake for rest. Thomas lifted Alice down, his hands lingering on her waist a second too long. The intimacy wasn't just for show anymore. Every moment he touched her was a moment of peace. Every moment she was near him, the entity in her chest stopped clawing at her ribs, sated by his aura. Alara approached them, holding a flask of wine. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "You look tired, little thing," Alara cooed at Alice. "Riding with alphas is exhausting for the weak. Perhaps you should wait in the carriage with the baggage." Alice looked at the woman. The shadow thing attached to Alara was pulsing. It was hungry. "Let me rip her throat out," the entity hissed. "She tastes like spoiled meat." "I'm fine," Alice said, her voice steady. "She stays with me," Thomas said, stepping between them. Alara laughed, a cold, tinkling sound. "Oh, Thomas, you're playing a dangerous game. You think she balances you? She is a void. Eventually, she will swallow you whole." She leaned in close, whispering so only they could hear. "I know what she is. I've read the forbidden texts, too. Silencers don't have mates, my king. They have victims." Alara walked away, leaving a scent of sulphur and roses in her wake. Thomas looked down at Alice, his expression unreadable. "Is it true?" Alice looked at the frozen lake, at the cracks in the ice. "I don't know." No silencer has lived long enough to find out. Thomas reached out, tilting her chin up. The air around them seemed to vibrate. Then we will write a new history. He leaned down, intending to kiss her, to seal the lie, or perhaps to test the truth. But a scream shattered the air. The scream came from the edge of the woods. Thomas shifted instantly, his body blurring into the massive black wolf. He roared, a sound that shook the snow from the trees, commanding the pack to rally. Alice didn't shift. She couldn't. But she ran. She ran toward the danger, the entity inside her surging with excitement. Blood. Fear. Chaos. They found a young guard writhing on the ground, his skin turning black, veins bulging as if his blood were boiling. Standing over him was not a wolf, nor a bear, but a reaper. A creature of shadow and bone, summoned from the darker planes of magic. The wolves circled it, snarling, but they were afraid. Physical claws passed right through the creature's smoky form. Thomas lunged, his jaws snapping at the reaper's neck, but he only missed. The reaper swung a skeletal arm, and Thomas was thrown backward, crashing into a tree with a sickening crunch. "Thomas!" Alice screamed. The reaper turned its empty eye sockets toward her. It froze. It recognized what she was. "Silencer!" the creature rasped, a sound like grinding stones. "Abomination!" It lunged for her. Alice didn't run. She couldn't. The fear that usually paralyzed her vanished, replaced by a cold, ancient anger. The entity took the wheel. She raised her hand. "Stop!" The command wasn't spoken. It was detonated. A shock wave of silence blasted outward. The bird stopped singing. The wind stopped blowing. The wolves stopped growling. The world went grey. The reaper froze in mid-air, its smoky form vibrating. Alice walked forward. Her eyes were no longer violet. They were voids of absolute blackness. Veins of ink crawled up her neck, across her face. She looked terrifying. She looked like a goddess of death. She reached out and grabbed the reaper's face. "You do not belong here," Alice/entity spoke. Two voices layered over each other. She squeezed. The reaper shrieked, a sound felt rather than heard, as she absorbed it. She drank the dark magic, pulling the shadow into her own body. The creature dissolved, sucked into the vortex of her chest until nothing was left but the snowy clearing. Alice stood there, swaying. The black veins receded, but she looked pale, deathly ill. The energy she had absorbed was toxic, foreign. She collapsed. Thomas was there before she hit the ground. He had shifted back to human form, ignoring his own broken ribs. He scooped her up, his eyes wide with horror and awe. "Alice," he commanded, shaking her. "Wake up!" She opened her eyes, groggily. Did I save him?" Thomas looked at the guard, who was now breathing normally, the black poison gone. Then he looked at Alice, who was shivering violently. "You ate it," Thomas whispered, terrified. "You ate the magic." "It was spicy," she murmured, and then her eyes rolled back. "We ride," Thomas bellowed to the stunned patrol. "Back to the castle, now!" They rode like the hounds of hell were snapping at their heels. Thomas held Alice against him, pouring his own alpha heat into her, trying to keep her heart beating. He could feel the foreign magic warring inside her, trying to tear her apart. Back at the castle, he bypassed the infirmary and took her straight to his chambers. He kicked the door shut and laid her on the bed. "Everyone out," he ordered the servants. "Leave us." When they were alone, he grabbed a dagger from his bedside table. He didn't hesitate. He sliced his own palm open, the blood welling up thick and rich, alpha blood, potent with healing and power. He pressed his bleeding hand to her lips. "Drink," he ordered. "You need to ground the energy. Drink." Alice groaned, instinct taking over. She grabbed his wrist and drank. The effect was immediate. Colour returned to her cheeks. The shaking stopped. But as she drank, a bond formed. It wasn't the pack bond. It was something deeper, something forbidden, a blood oath. Thomas watched as her eyes fluttered open. The violet was back, bright and clear. She licked a drop of blood from her lip, and the sight hit him like a physical blow. "You saved me," she whispered, realizing what he had done. "You gave me your blood. You know what that means?" "I know," Thomas said hoarsely. He wrapped his bandaged hand. "It means I can feel you now. Not just your silence. You." He could feel her fear, her gratitude, and underneath it all, a longing that matched his own. "Who summoned that thing?" Alice asked, sitting up, stronger now. "Only a high-level sorcerer can summon a reaper," Thomas said, his face hardening. "Or someone working with one." "Elara," they said in unison. Thomas paced the room. "She tried to have me killed, or she tried to test you. Either way, she has declared war." "She knows what I am," Alice said. "She called me a void." "You are not a void," Thomas said, fierce, stopping in front of her. "You are the only real thing in this entire kingdom." He sat on the edge of the bed. The adrenaline was fading, leaving them both raw. "Alice," he said softly. "The voices. When you absorbed that thing, I heard something else. Amidst the noise, I heard her thoughts." Alice froze. "Elara's?" "No," Thomas said, looking into her eyes. "Yours." Alice stopped breathing. If he could hear her thoughts, he would know everything. He would know how scared she was. He would know that she was falling in love with him. "What did you hear?" she whispered. Thomas reached out, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. His touch was electric. "I heard you say my name. Not King. Not Alpha. Just Thomas." He leaned in, and this time there was no scream to interrupt them. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was desperate, fueled by near-death and high-stakes politics. It tasted of copper and snow. Alice melted into him, her hands tangling in his hair. For a moment, the entity was quiet, lulled by the sheer force of the Alpha's affection. When they broke apart, breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "We are going to kill them," he promised, his voice a low growl. "Every single person who tries to hurt you. We are going to kill them all." The kiss changed everything. Before, it was a partnership. Now it was a crusade. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. The winter ball was approaching, the final night of the solstice celebrations. It was traditional for the king to announce his betrothal. Everyone expected him to name Elara. Thomas had other plans. He spent the days in the war room, moving troops, securing loyalties. Alice stayed by his side, no longer hiding in the shadows. She sat at the table, silent, but her presence kept Thomas sharp. The generals were terrified of her. They had heard the rumors of the Reaper. They called her the Shadow Queen behind her back. But the enemy was moving, too. On the night of the ball, Alice stood in front of the mirror. Thomas had commissioned a dress for her. It was midnight blue, the color of the sky just before total darkness. It was backless, exposing the scars of her past. But the fabric shimmered like it was woven from starlight. "You look dangerous," Thomas said from the doorway. He was wearing his formal military regalia, medals gleaming, a sword at his hip. "I feel dangerous," Alice admitted. The entity was humming, anticipating violence. "Thomas, something feels wrong. The air is too thin." "Elara will make her move tonight," Thomas said, walking over to clasp a necklace around her throat, a heavy silver collar set with obsidian. It was a protective ward, ancient and priceless. "And when she does, we will be ready." They entered the ballroom to a fanfare of trumpets. The room fell silent. All eyes were on the wolfless girl who had bewitched the king. Elara was there, wearing blood red. She smiled as they entered, raising her glass in a mock toast. Beside her stood Lord Marcus, looking smug. The music started, a slow, haunting waltz. Thomas led Alice to the floor. They moved together perfectly, the blood oath allowing them to anticipate each other's movements. "They are surrounding us," Thomas murmured as he spun her. "Guards at the north exit, archers on the balcony." "I can feel the magic," Alice whispered. "Under the floorboards, runes. They've rigged the ballroom." "Trap," Thomas confirmed. "If I try to arrest them, they blow the room." "So we can't strike first," Alice realized. "No," Thomas grinned, a wolfish, reckless grin. "We have to let them trigger it." The music swelled. The tension rose. Suddenly the lights died. Screams erupted. The floorboards exploded, not with fire, but with binding vines made of shadow. They lashed out, wrapping around the ankles of the loyal guards, pinning them. "Now!" Ilara's voice shrieked from the darkness. A circle of fire ignited around Thomas and Alice, trapping them in the center of the dance floor. Ilara stepped into the light of the flames, flanked by Marcus and a dozen rogue wolves. "Did you really think you could outsmart me, boy? I have the council, I have the army, and I have the magic." "You have nothing," Thomas spat, shielding Alice with his body. "I have the crown," Marcus yelled, drawing his sword. "Kill him. Leave the girl for the experiments." The rogue wolves shifted and lunged. Thomas roared, shifting into his massive black form. He caught the first wolf in mid-air, snapping its neck. The fight was brutal, chaotic, but there were too many of them, and the magical fire was closing in, burning the oxygen. Alice stood in the center of the chaos. She watched Thomas fight, watched him bleed for her. She saw a blade slice across his flank. He went down, snarling, pinned by 3 wolves. Marcus stepped forward, raising his sword to deliver the killing blow to the king. "No!" Alice screamed. She didn't ask the entity for help this time. She grabbed it by the throat and dragged it out. She slammed her hands onto the floor. The ballroom didn't just go silent. It ceased to exist. A dome of absolute void expanded from Alice. The fire vanished. The vines withered. The sound was sucked out of the room. The wolves attacking Thomas fell unconscious, their minds wiped blank by the sensory deprivation. Marcus dropped his sword, clutching his head, screaming soundlessly as his thoughts were ripped away. Only Thomas was spared. The blood oath acted as an anchor, tethering him to reality. He looked up. Alice was floating, literally floating a few inches off the ground. Her hair was white, turned stark white by the sheer output of energy. Her skin was cracking like porcelain, glowing violet light leaking from the fissures. She wasn't controlling the power anymore. She was the bomb. She turned to Ilara. Ilara, powerful witch alpha that she was, looked terrified. She tried to cast a spell, but the magic fizzled before it left her fingertips. "You cannot cast magic in a void." Alice pointed a finger at Ilara. "You are." Loud, the voice that came out of Alice wasn't human. It was the sound of mountains crumbling. Ilara was lifted off her feet by an invisible hand. She was thrown across the room, smashing through the stone pillar and pinned against the wall. Alice turned to Marcus. He was already on his knees, weeping. The threat was neutralized. The coup was crushed in seconds. But Alice didn't stop. The void kept expanding. It was eating the room. It was going to eat the castle. "Alice!" Thomas shifted back, naked and bleeding. He scrambled toward her, fighting the pressure of the void. "Alice, stop! You've won. Stop!" She didn't hear him. The entity was fully in control now, reveling in the destruction. Thomas reached her. He couldn't touch her. The energy was searing hot. But he had to. "Alice, come back to me," he begged. He grabbed her hand. The shockwave threw them both backward. The void collapsed instantly, rushing back into Alice's small body with a sickening thud. Silence returned to the ballroom. Real silence. Thomas coughed, sitting up in the rubble. "Alice, She lay a few feet away. She was still. Her hair was white as snow. Her dress was in tatters. Thomas crawled to her. He put his ear to her chest. Nothing. No heartbeat. No breath. The silence in his head was permanent now, because the silencer was dead. "No," Thomas whispered. "No, no, no." He gathered her broken body into his arms and let out a howl that broke the remaining windows of the palace, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief that brought the surviving court to their knees. The funeral was not for the dead. It was for the living who had to go on. But Thomas refused to authorize a funeral. 3 days had passed since the catastrophe in the ballroom. The rubble had been cleared, revealing the scorched skeleton of the palace wing. Lord Marcus was in the dungeons, his mind shattered, drooling and unresponsive. Lady Alara was gone, consumed by the void Alice had summoned, leaving behind nothing but her red dress, empty and pristine on the floor. But Thomas did not care about justice or reconstruction. He cared only for the body lying in state in the center of the royal solarium. Alice looked like a sleeping Snow White. Her skin was marble pale, her white hair fanned out around her head like a halo of frost. She was cold to the touch. No breath fogged the mirror held to her lips. No pulse fluttered in her throat. Yet she did not decay. Thomas sat by her side, unwashed, unshaven, still wearing the ruined remnants of his uniform. He held her cold hand in his, staring at her face. The pack was in chaos. Without the king's orders, the generals were squabbling. The whispers were starting. The king is broken. The king is mad. But Thomas wasn't mad. He was empty. The silence Alice had left behind wasn't the soothing quiet of a library. It was the vacuum of space. His alpha gift, the telepathy that had tormented him for years, was gone, burned out. He couldn't hear his guards, his generals, or even the hum of the pack bond. He was deaf to the world he was supposed to rule. "You promised," he rasped, his voice cracking from disuse. He squeezed her hand. "You said you were my shield. You didn't say you would die to do it." The doors to the solarium creaked open. Thomas didn't look up. "I said no visitors. I am not a visitor, Alpha. I am a memory." Thomas turned. Standing in the doorway was an ancient woman. She was tiny, bent over a gnarled staff, wearing the grey wool of the wolfless. Her eyes were milky white, blind. "Who are you?" Thomas growled, standing up. "I am the keeper of the old words," the woman said, hobbling forward. The guards at the door seemed unable to stop her, or perhaps they didn't see her. "And I am here to tell you that the girl is not dead." Thomas froze. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing the woman's frail shoulders. "What did you say?" "Gently, Wolf." The crone cackled softly. "She is not dead. Her body is here, preserved by the residual energy of the void. But her soul was dragged under." "Under?" "The entity she carried," the woman explained, tapping her staff on the stone floor. "It is not a demon, boy. It is a vault. It stores things that are too heavy for the world to carry. Pain, secrets, sins. When she opened the door to swallow your enemies, the vacuum pulled her in too." "How do I get her back?" Thomas demanded. "You cannot," the woman said simply. "The void is the space between heartbeats. To enter it is to stop your own heart. To leave it is to leave behind what makes you an alpha." Thomas looked back at Alice. He remembered the way she had looked at him in the snow, terrified, yet fierce. He remembered the silence she gave him, not just the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. "I don't care about being an alpha," Thomas said. "I never wanted the noise. I only wanted her." The old woman smiled, exposing toothless gums. "Then you must die, King Thomas. You must die to walk the frozen path. And if you find her, you must give her the one thing a silencer has never had." "What is that?" "A voice," the woman whispered. The ritual was simple and terrifying. The old woman prepared a draught of nightshade and hemlock, mixed with the ash of a weirwood tree. It was a poison that would stop the heart for exactly 1 hour. If Thomas didn't wake up by then, the brain damage would be irreversible. If he didn't return from the void, his body would simply rot. He laid down beside Alice on the stone slab. He took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "If I don't come back," Thomas told his terrified beta, who was standing witness, "burn the castle, let the forest take it back." "Thomas, don't!" the beta pleaded. Thomas drank the poison. It tasted like copper and ice. Within seconds, his limbs went numb. His vision blurred. The ceiling of the solarium dissolved into grey mist. His heart gave one last, heavy thud, and then stopped. Thomas opened his eyes. He was standing on a plain of obsidian glass. The sky was a swirling vortex of violet and black clouds, the exact color of the entity. There was no wind, no sound, no horizon, just endless, crushing dark. "Alice!" he screamed. His voice made no sound. He clutched his throat. He shouted again, but the void swallowed the vibrations instantly. This is her world, he realized. Absolute silence. He started walking. He didn't know where to go, but he felt a pull, a tug in his chest where the blood oath connected them. It was a faint, golden thread stretching into the darkness. He followed the thread for what felt like eternity. Time didn't exist here. He walked until his phantom legs burned, until his mind began to fray at the edges. Then he saw it. In the distance, a mountain of ice rose from the glass plain. At the peak of the mountain sat a throne made of frozen shadows, and on the throne sat the entity. It looked like Alice, but wrong. It was 50 feet tall, its skin made of storm clouds, its eyes burning white stars. It was magnificent and terrifying. Held in its lap like a doll was the human Alice. She looked tiny, fragile, asleep. Thomas ran. He scrambled up the slick ice of the mountain, slipping, cutting his hands on the shards. "Go back!" the entity boomed. It didn't speak with words. It spoke with gravity. The pressure forced Thomas to his knees. "She is mine. She is resting." "She is mine!" Thomas yelled, though no sound came out. He projected the thought with every ounce of his will. "You are noise," the entity rumbled. "The world is loud. It hurts her. Here, she is safe. Here, she is silent." Thomas struggled to his feet. He looked at the human Alice. She looked peaceful, yes, but she also looked cold. So cold. "She doesn't want to be safe," Thomas projected, channeling his memories of her, her defiance in the throne room, her laughter by the fire, the way she had slapped his hand away. "She wants to live. Living is loud. Living is messy. You aren't protecting her. You're keeping her in a cage." The entity roared, a soundless blast of wind that tore at Thomas's soul. She is the silencer. It is her purpose. Her purpose, Thomas pushed forward, step by agonizing step, is to be loved. He reached the top. He stood before the giant form of the entity. He looked up at its starry eyes. "Take me instead," Thomas offered. The entity paused. "Exchange?" "My silence for hers," Thomas thought. "I will stay here. I will be your vessel. I will hold the noise of the world. Let her go." The entity looked down at the small human in its lap. Then it looked at Thomas. It sensed the truth in his heart. It sensed the alpha power, vast, ancient, and willing to be sacrificed. "Accepted," the entity whispered. It gently placed Alice on the ice in front of Thomas. Thomas fell to his knees beside her. She was fading, turning transparent. She was waking up in the real world, leaving him behind. "Goodbye, my compass," Thomas mouthed, touching her cheek. But Alice's eyes snapped open. In the void, her eyes were not violet. They were blazing gold. She grabbed Thomas's wrist. "No," she spoke. And in the void, her voice, was thunder. Alice stood up. She didn't look at the entity. She looked at Thomas. "You idiot," she said, her voice echoing across the obsidian plains. "You think I stayed silent to protect myself?" Thomas stared at her, confused. You can speak here." "I can speak anywhere," Alice said, tears forming in her eyes. "I stayed silent because of you." The entity shrank, swirling down until it was a shadow standing behind Alice. "The prophecy wasn't about a silencer killing an alpha," Alice said, her voice trembling. "It was about a silencer waking one." She took Thomas's face in her hands. "The reason I whispered, 'Stay silent,' that night, the reason I never spoke, is because my voice is the key. If I speak to an alpha with the intent of love, it doesn't just silence the pack mind, it breaks the barrier between the worlds." She looked around at the void. "This isn't death, Thomas. This is the source. This is where magic comes from. If I speak, I open the door. And if the door is open, the magic floods back," Thomas realized. "Not just wolf-shifting, real magic, the old magic." "The world isn't ready," Alice cried. "That's why I held it back. That's why I let them treat me like a dog, to keep the door closed, to keep you safe from this." Thomas looked at the swirling chaos of the sky. He understood now. She wasn't a monster. She was a dam, and she had held back the ocean for her entire life. "But the door is open now," Thomas said softly. "You screamed to save me." "I broke the world for you," Alice whispered, "and now we are trapped in the flood." Thomas stood up. He pulled her into his arms. The cold of the void couldn't touch them when they were touching each other. "Then let it flood," Thomas said. "Let the magic come back. We will build a boat. We will build a new world." "You don't understand," Alice sobbed into his chest. "If we go back, you won't be the Alpha King anymore. The magic will change everyone, the hierarchy, the packs. It will all dissolve. You will be just a man." Thomas laughed. It was a sound of pure freedom. "Alice," he said, kissing her forehead, "I have wanted to be just a man since the day I was born." He turned to the entity, the shadow of the past. "We are leaving," Thomas commanded, "not with alpha authority, but with human resolve. And you are coming with us, not as a burden, but as a gift." He took Alice's hand. "Scream, Alice," Thomas said. "Scream us home." Alice looked at him. She took a deep breath. She drew in the cold, the silence, the pain of 1,000 years of wolfless oppression, and she screamed. It wasn't a scream of terror, it was a scream of birth. Thomas woke up with a gasp, air rushing into his lungs like fire. He fell off the stone slab, retching. Beside him, Alice sat up, coughing, her skin flushing pink with life. The old woman in the corner laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "It is done." Thomas looked around. The solarium was different. The air shimmered. The stone walls were humming. He looked out the window. The snow was glowing. The wolves in the courtyard were shifting, but their forms were different. Some had wings, some had horns, some were made of starlight. The strict caste system of Alpha, Beta, Omega, it was gone, washed away by the flood of wild magic that Alice had unleashed. Thomas looked at Alice. Her hair was still white, but her eyes were no longer violet. One was grey, like his. One was gold. She looked at him, terrified of his reaction. "I ruined your kingdom." Thomas stood up. He walked over to her, his legs shaky but his heart full. He felt no telepathy, no voices, just his own thoughts, clear and sharp. He took her hand and led her to the window. He looked out at the chaotic, beautiful, magical new world she had created. "You didn't ruin it, Alice," Thomas whispered, pulling her against him. "You woke it up." He kissed her, and for the first time in history, the king and the wolfless stood as equals, not ruled by biology, but bound by choice. The silence was gone, but the music had just begun. Like, share, and subscribe for more stories of magic, rebellion, and love that rewrites the stars.